right, Angel.
Welcome
Back. Have you been a good girl?
Yeah, I've been helping Tifa.
Oh, you did you? Well, well.
You made it. Where'd you get that? I can't remember the last time I saw a real one. Huh? How sweet. When did you get so thoughtful?
A guy can change. Has been 5 years.
Huh?
I need to talk to Barrett.
Right. Come on in.
Hello and welcome to another video, and today I'm finally reviewing Final Fantasy VII Remake. The long wait for the Final Fantasy VII Remake is over and you can play the game in its entirety from start to finish. Oh wait, you can't do that. So Final Fantasy VII Remake is actually technically part one of a planned series of games. And right now, they're still not saying how many parts that this is going to be. Is it going to be 3 parts? Is it going to be 6 parts? I don't know. Nobody knows the answer right now. They haven't given a concrete answer as to how many parts, but what I can tell you now that I have played through the entirety of Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, which is what I'm going to refer to this game as throughout this review, I can tell you honestly, they've taken the entire section of Midgar, which only is about 10 hours of the original game, and they've expanded it into its own 50-hour JRPG. And they've honestly made good on the promise of that. I was incredibly skeptical. As you guys know, I made a giant video about this last year on the channel, talking about how I was incredibly skeptical about this remake and what they're going to do. And while I still think it is kind of shitty that they are referring to it as Final Fantasy VII Remake when it's only the first part in a planned series of games, I have to give credit where credit's due. They've actually done a really good job doing this whole thing and making a 10-hour part of the original game into a 50-hour game in its own right. So Final Fantasy VII, just to give you guys a little bit of history, is one of my favorite games of all time, and it holds a special place for me specifically because it was the first JRPG I played coming off of the Super Nintendo, and it really got me into playing JRPGs on the PS1. It was the first one that really grabbed my attention. I think that can be said for a lot of people out there. A lot of people had Final Fantasy VII as their first true Japanese role-playing game experience. So over 20 years later, the story's still incredibly fresh. The characters are still just as memorable as they were over 20 years ago. And I think that taking 10 hours of the original game and expanding it into a 50-hour game in its own right, while I originally thought it was going to be bad, they actually did a fantastic job. So I want to kind of dive in today. Now, with that being said, there are going to be spoilers in this review. I'm going to try and keep the end parts of the story towards the end of the video. I'm not going to talk about it here at the beginning, and I will let you guys know way in advance when I'm going to talk about that stuff. So if you don't want to know specifically how this ends, then you can skip that part of the review. So let's dive into Final Fantasy VII Remake. So for those uninitiated on Final Fantasy VII specifically, you play as a character named Cloud Strife. He's kind of a mercenary for hire. He used to work for a military group called Soldier in this whole world that Final Fantasy VII takes place. Specifically, this part of the game takes place in the city of Midgar, which is only a small portion of the entire world that Final Fantasy VII takes place in. And that was the most fascinating and intriguing part of this entire experience for me personally. Was I just couldn't see how they were going to flesh out a 10-hour part of a larger story into its own 50-hour game. And they actually did it here, and they do a wonderful job not only of just prolonging everything and really getting down into story bits, but also added content. They've added story with different characters, and they've also made you care about other characters that were very secondary in the original game. You know, in the original game, the characters of Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge were very secondary characters. They didn't really matter that much. And one thing that the remake does really nicely here is it fleshes these characters out completely. And they all have their own personalities and unique traits. And I think that really sets the tone for the rest of this experience. So that's a really fantastic part of the game. Another aspect of the game that I really loved was the battle system. You know, I was very skeptical specifically of the battle system. Final Fantasy VII's battle system is probably my favorite JRPG battle system of all time. So going into this, knowing it was going to be more action-oriented, knowing that it was going to be more geared towards even like Final Fantasy 15 combat, I was kind of perplexed as to how they were going to tackle that here. And it works really well. One thing I will say is it is not a straight action RPG. There is a lot more planning and strategy to it than you think, but it is also not a completely turn-based system. You control only one of the 3 characters at any given time, but you can have a party of 3 and you can switch between characters. So if you want to play through an entire battle with Barrett, you can go ahead and do that. It doesn't matter. And I think that's a cool aspect of the game. Another thing that's been kind of upgraded yet stays the same is the materia system. The materia system was awesome in Final Fantasy VII, and I think the remake does a good job of reintroducing fans to that system and allowing them to upgrade different pieces of materia, which allows you to unlock different spells and different magic abilities in the game and whatnot. So they did a fantastic job with that. They also do a good job of like bringing that original equipment in. One thing that I really like about the remake is in the original game, and part of this was just due to, you know, the time in which this original game came out. You know, you could get different weapons and stuff for each character, like the Twin Stainers for Cloud, for example. Here, they actually change it, so you see different variants of these weapons on the characters, something they couldn't do in the original. So when you switch out these weapons, they look different on the character. Another really cool aspect is when you assign materia to a character's weapon, it actually shows physically on their weapon, and I thought that was a really cool aspect of the game as well. The voice acting here is phenomenal. I have to give credit where credit's due. I don't think there was a single character in the game that the performance I was disappointed in, but I simply have to put, and this is a minor spoiler, but if anybody's ever played Final Fantasy VII, I don't think this is a spoiler for a 20-year-old game. Red 13, one of my favorite characters from the original Final Fantasy VII, has his debut in this game, and while he's not a playable character, his voice acting is pitch perfect. I couldn't think of a better voice for that character. When he first speaks, it is exactly how I pictured his voice to sound as someone who's played through Final Fantasy VII at least 10 times. So I was really, really happy to hear that. I also think Sephiroth's voice is fantastic, but everybody's voice just fits their character so perfectly. Aerith, she sounds incredible. She sounds exactly how you would think. It's like they knew. It's like these creators knew exactly what these characters always sounded like, and they went out and found the voice actors that are perfect for these characters. So with all that being said, you know, this game kind of dives into, there's some side quests, there's a bunch of different things you could do, and I could sit here and I could drone on and on about how I think this aspect and that aspect is cool and how they changed this up and that up. But one of the more interesting aspects of Final Fantasy VII Remake are the little changes that they have made, not only to just minor details and stuff, but also to the overall story, because there are some changes. One thing you have to remember going into this game is this is a remake, it's not a remaster, which means they can change story beats up and they can alter things a little bit if they want to. And we'll get to that here in a moment. But just walking through the world, seeing all these environments that I've seen for years in a very PS1 era graphical quality, seeing it in, you know, high-res PS4 glory, it's really incredible, and you have to step back and look. There are many times where I stopped playing the game and just kind of looked around at the world and was just blown away, not only by the detail, but just the level of care that went into this project. You know, I wasn't expecting what we actually got. I was kind of expecting this to be kind of a cash-in just for Final Fantasy VII fans to go, oh, we got another thing, you know, like, you know, 10, 15 years ago we got Advent Children and a slew of spin-off Final Fantasy VII games. And I kind of thought they would go that route with this remake. They don't do that. They've actually taken the time and a lot of care here. One of the other really cool aspects of this game is in the collectibles, you can collect different music tracks throughout the game, and they're variations of original music from Final Fantasy VII, but they're done in such subtle different ways, and it's just one of the more unique aspects of the game. And a lot of the music tracks also allude to places that you will go in future installments of this series. So that's potentially really interesting as well. Overall, it took me about 45 hours to get through Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that was me doing all the side quests, getting these music CDs and whatnot, and taking my time with the game. If there's one negative aspect I have about Final Fantasy VII Remake, it is within the battle system, specifically not the battle system itself, but grinding. One of my favorite parts about the original Final Fantasy VII is grinding your levels and getting higher, gear and equipment, and leveling your characters up, and a lot of that was done by random encounters. Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't have random encounters. You see all the enemies on the map, and everything is extremely linear, which makes me potentially really excited for the next part of this series, because now we're up to the open world part of Final Fantasy VII, and I'm very curious to see what this team does to open and expand that. But in Final Fantasy VII Remake, when you beat the game, it does give you the option to go back and play through the chapters of the game. So you can level up your characters. I think the max level is 50. And it does also have a hard mode, which is something I don't personally feel like tackling because I read a little bit into it. But for those that are interested, that is also something that is there. But 45 hours it took me to get through this, and that was me pretty much doing everything. I played through the game on normal. I had a blast with it. Really went into this hoping that it was going to be good. I knew that it was only the first part in the series. I was bummed about that, and I'm glad to walk out the other end of it and think it's one of the best games that's come out this year. And everything just about it is so well done. Now, yes, with that, there's still the stigma of, well, this is only part one of a larger story, and I will say that when the game does wrap up at the end, it does give you that the journey to be continued kind of a thing. And some people, especially players that have never played the original Final Fantasy VII, are going to be bummed by that. As someone who has played through that game many, many times, I was bummed by that. So with that being said, I really enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy VII Remake. Personally, I'm giving the game an A. I really enjoy. I think it's worth your time. Absolutely. If you're a fan of JRPGs, if you're a fan of Final Fantasy, maybe you're a Final Fantasy fan out there that for some reason hasn't played Final Fantasy VII because you always thought it just looked old and dingy, this is your chance to experience this game and experience this story that you've probably seen on the internet for years and years and years through various memes and whatnot. And it's a fantastic way to experience it. So A is my final grade for the game. I do briefly want to talk about spoilers here at the end of the video, so if you don't want to know how this game ends, then you can end watching the video here. So massive spoilers here. The end of this game is interesting because they are kind of going with an alternate timeline story, which gives them an out to change events of this game. The biggest reveal at the end of the game is that Zack Fair, the character that kind of helped Cloud get onto his path for the beginning of Final Fantasy VII, in the original game, he died. And he's the person that gave Cloud the Buster Sword. In this game, it appears he didn't die. So that opens up the door for a potentially interesting storyline. And I'm interested to see what these developers do and how far down the rabbit hole they go with it. Another interesting aspect of the game is there's these Dementor-like creatures called the Whispers. They're kind of explained as these beings that make sure that destiny follows the path that it's supposed to. And at the end of the game, you fight what I can only describe as like the final boss of Death Stranding. It's basically what it looked like. And when you beat that, you then fight like an altered version of Sephiroth. And it's not really determined if it actually is Sephiroth or if it's these Whispers playing a trick on you, but that also opens the door to this alternate timeline thing. So it's leaving the game open for them to interpret it a different way than you remembered it, while also staying true to the original story. And I love the final cutscene with Sephiroth talking to Cloud about the 7 seconds, and I really enjoyed that. So overall, I'm really happy with Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, and hopefully we see Part 2 sooner rather than later. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video review. Remember, as always, to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And as always, until next time.